There is a small town in northern Rhode Island, tucked between a stand of white birch trees and the slow, indifferent curl of a river that locals have always called Stillwater Creek, though no official map has ever confirmed that name. The town of Glenmorrow is the kind of place that looks the same in October as it does in February, gray-skied, leaf-blown, perpetually half-awake. It has a post office, a diner whose sign has needed repainting since 1988, a school with a cracked gymnasium floor, and the particular, deep-set quiet of a community that has learned, across generations, not to ask too many questions of itself. It is the kind of place where people know their neighbors' cars but not their inner lives, where front porches are occupied and backyards are private, and where tragedy, when it finally arrives, is dressed in such ordinary clothes that no one recognizes it at first for what it is. It was here, on the frost-hard morning of November 14, 1996, that a 7-year-old girl named Clara Jean Whitmore walked out of her family's back door, crossed the stiffened grass of her yard, passed through the wooden gate her father had painted blue the previous summer, and was never seen again. She was wearing a red wool coat with a missing button on the left cuff. She was carrying a small canvas backpack with a painted rabbit on the front, the paint already fading at the edges. She had eaten a bowl of oatmeal with brown sugar, no raisins. She had a strong opinion about raisins at 7:04 in the morning. She was 7 years old in the 2nd grade and had recently lost a front tooth. She had chattered to her mother that morning about a drawing she was planning to make. She had waved from the doorway, and the person who knew exactly what happened to her after that gate swung shut had been living quietly, unremarkably, in plain sight for the next 26 years. She was wearing a red coat with a missing button. She was carrying a backpack with a rabbit on the front. She was 7 years old. Glenmorrow, Rhode Island sits in Providence County, roughly 17 miles north of the state capital, though in spirit and in economic pace, it might as well be 100 miles removed from the marble corridors and late-night restaurant lights of Providence. The town's population in 1996 was approximately 3,400 people, a number that had barely shifted in either direction since 1970, a stasis that spoke to the particular arithmetic of small towns. For every family that moved away seeking something better, another moved in seeking something quieter. Most of Glenmorrow's residents worked at one of two places: the Heartline Textile Mill on the east side of Route 44, which had been operating in some form since 1921 and employed roughly 400 people at any given time, or the Birch Hill Distribution Warehouse, a sprawling, windowless aluminum structure 3 miles outside the town center that smelled of rubber and motor oil and employed another 200. Glenmorrow was not poor in the way that certain communities in Rhode Island were poor in 1996. It was not hollowed out, not visibly desperate, but it existed in that tense economic middle distance where nothing was ever quite secure, and every winter brought the low-level dread of whether the heating bill would clear, whether the overtime would continue, whether the mill would keep running. The Whitmore family lived at 114 Caldwell Lane, a 2-story colonial with green shutters and a porch swing that creaked in the November wind. The home was set back from the road by a modest front yard, bordered on the left by the Prentice property, a similar colonial, blue-gray, with a basketball hoop at the end of the driveway, and on the right by a narrow access lane that ran behind 3 houses and connected to the parking area behind Birch Hardware on Maple Terrace. The lane also gave access, further along, to a footpath that descended to Stillwater Creek, 40 yards through Birch and Old Oak. Martin Whitmore, 39, worked as a floor supervisor at the Heartline Mill, a position he had held for 11 years. His wife, Donna Whitmore, 36, worked part-time at Glenmorrow Elementary School as a lunchroom aide, a job she had taken when Clara started kindergarten so that their schedules would align. Clara was their only child, born on April 2, 1989, after 4 years of trying. Photographs from that year show a wide-eyed baby held by a visibly exhausted and radiant Donna, Martin standing slightly behind, one hand on Donna's shoulder, expression unreadable in the particular way that Martin Whitmore's expressions were always, to those who knew him, slightly unreadable. Those who knew the family in Glenmorrow described Donna as warm and careful, the kind of mother who double-checked backpack zippers and left notes in lunch boxes, and knew the first and last names of every child in Clara's class. They described Martin as quiet, not unfriendly, not cold in any way that anyone could specifically point to, but measured. A man who chose his words the way other men chose their tools, deliberately, one at a time, and never more than necessary. He was reliable at the mill. He maintained the house well. He did not cause trouble. He was the kind of neighbor you might live beside for years without ever feeling you truly knew. November 14, 1996, was a Thursday. The sky over Glenmorrow that morning was the color of old pewter, low and flat from horizon to horizon. The temperature at 6 a.m. had registered 29 degrees at the monitoring station on Route 44, the season's first hard freeze. A weather advisory had gone out the previous night on the Providence radio stations, calling for a possible light snow by midday. The ground outside was rigid with frost, each blade of grass stiffened to a pale wire. Dried leaves, brown and flat as paper, skittered across sidewalks and caught in the rusted curves of garden fences. The town smelled of wood smoke and cold air and the mineral sharpness of the frozen creek. Donna Whitmore would later tell investigators that the morning had been ordinary in every particular. Clara had woken at 6:48 as usual. She had not wanted to get up also usual. She dressed herself with minimal help, which she was proud of, and came down the stairs carrying her backpack already packed, which Donna had prepared the night before out of habit. Library book, lunchbox, extra mittens. Clara ate her oatmeal at the kitchen table. No raisins. She had chattered to her mother about a drawing she was planning at school that day. A rabbit wearing a winter coat, she said, because it was cold now and rabbits needed coats. Her school bus was scheduled to arrive at the corner of Caldwell Lane and Maple Terrace at 7:22. The corner was a 2-minute walk from the front door. However, on mornings when Martin was home, Clara had a habit. She would go out through the backyard to say goodbye to the family's beagle, Pepper, who was kept in a small fenced run along the rear side of the property, and who took the bus departures with considerable vocal protest if not properly farewelled. Martin Whitmore was home that morning. He had taken a scheduled personal day from the mill, a day accumulated through overtime the prior month, processed and approved 2 weeks earlier. According to Donna, he was inside the living room watching the morning news when Clara put on her red coat, zipped her backpack, and announced she was going to say goodbye to Pepper before the bus. Donna told investigators she had replied, quote, "Okay, baby, but don't dawdle." Clara had nodded with the gravity of a child who has been told not to dawdle many times and always means to comply. Donna heard the back door open. She heard the familiar creak of the gate latch. She returned to her own morning routine, dishes in the sink, her own coat to find, a note to write for the grocery run planned for that afternoon. That was the last exchange anyone has confirmed between Donna Whitmore and her daughter. That was the last confirmed sound of Clara Jean Whitmore's presence in the world, a back door, a gate latch, then the ordinary silence of a November morning. At 7:22, the school bus arrived at the corner of Caldwell and Maple Terrace, right on schedule. The driver, Earl Simmons, a man who had been running the same route for 9 years and who knew every child on it by name, waited the customary 2 minutes. No Clara. He pulled away at 7:24, noting her absence mentally as an anomaly. In 4 weeks she had not once missed the bus, not once been late to the corner. He assumed an illness, a family appointment. He did not call the school until he reached his next stop, at which point the office noted the absence and moved on to the day's business. At approximately 7:35, Donna Whitmore went to the back door to call Clara in, assuming she had lost track of time with Pepper. The yard was empty. The gate to the dog run was closed and latched from the outside, as it always was when someone had been through. Pepper was inside the run, tail moving, waiting with the hopeful patience of a dog anticipating breakfast. The yard was otherwise empty and entirely quiet. Clara's small sneaker impressions were clearly visible in the frost on the grass. A child's narrow stride crossing from the back door toward the dog run gate, and then, at a point about 8 feet short of the run, veering sharply left toward the opening of the access lane. The sneaker prints ended precisely where the grass gave way to the packed, dark dirt of the lane, dirt that had frozen solid and held no impression at that temperature. The prints simply stopped, the way trails in nightmares stop, at the edge of something that cannot be followed. There was no continuation. There was no return path. There was just the frozen grass and the prints, and then nothing. By 9 o'clock on the morning of November 14, 1996, 2 Providence County Sheriff's deputies had arrived at 114 Caldwell Lane in response to Donna Whitmore's call to dispatch, placed at 7:47 a.m. by 11 that same morning. Glen Moreau's 4-person investigative unit, its full complement, had been deployed. By 2 in the afternoon, a ground search team of 22 volunteers was combing the access lane and the wooded corridor leading south toward Stillwater Creek. 2 officers in a flat-bottomed aluminum boat worked the creek itself, moving east to west across its November shallows. The water was low that season, barely 3 feet at its deepest in that stretch. The branches over the creek were bare and reached the water in places. The search team found nothing. The creek found nothing. The woods found nothing. The community response was swift and unmistakably sincere. By the morning of November 15th, more than 80 volunteers had registered with the coordination center established at the Glen Moreau Fire Station on Elm Street. A sign-in sheet from that morning, retained in the case file, shows names from 4 different towns, people who had driven in because they had seen the evening news. Flyers bearing Clara's school photograph from September were reproduced at the copy shop on Route 44 and distributed through the night. The image of a second grader in braids, gap-toothed, caught mid-smile in the particular unfocused optimism of a school photo. The flyers appeared on telephone poles, in diner windows, on the bulletin board at the post office. The diner kept a pot of coffee running for volunteers around the clock, and the owner refused payment from any searcher for 4 straight days. State investigators from the Rhode Island Department of Attorney General were brought in by November 17, 1996. The Providence Journal ran Clara's photograph on the front page on November 15th. Local television crews materialized that same afternoon and remained through the weekend. A candlelight gathering was organized at the Congregational Church on the evening of November 16th, 3 days after Clara's disappearance. Nearly 300 people attended. Donna Whitmore was present, supported on one side by her sister Linda, who had driven from Cranston the same day she had heard. Donna stood during the service without speaking, pale in the candlelight, eyes moving without focus. Martin Whitmore stood a few feet removed from his wife. He said a brief word to the minister. He thanked, personally and by hand, several of the search volunteers he recognized. He spoke to a television reporter outside afterward. He said, quote, "We just want Clara home. We are grateful to everyone who is out there looking. We are grateful for every single person." His voice was level. His hands were in his coat pockets. He did not cry. Those who knew him said the composure was characteristic, that Martin simply did not express himself the way other people did, that this was not something new or strange. His longtime supervisor at the Heartline Mill, a man named George Farrell, told a reporter from the Providence Journal several days later, "Martin is steady as a post in a storm. You'd never know from looking at him what was going on inside." Those words, offered in November of 1996 as a form of praise and explanation, would read with entirely different weight in the years that followed. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about the timeline from the very first week of the investigation. Martin Whitmore had given investigators an account of his morning. He had been in the living room from shortly after 7:00 a.m. watching the morning news. He had not heard Clara leave through the back door, had not seen her through any window, and had heard nothing unusual until Donna called for him from the backyard at approximately 7:40. He was consistent in this account across two interviews, one on November 14th and a follow-up on November 19th. Investigators mapped the Whitmore house floor plan carefully. The living room occupied the eastern end of the house, separated from the kitchen by a hallway and a partial wall. The kitchen window above the sink faced north, directly toward the backyard, the dog run, and the opening of the access lane. From the living room, visibility of the rear yard was, the investigators confirmed, effectively zero. Martin's account was architecturally coherent. That was the word the lead investigator used in his notes, coherent. The physical evidence collected in the first 72 hours was limited in what it could confirm. Clara's sneaker prints in the frost. A single partial tire impression in the surface of the access lane, consistent with a mid-size passenger vehicle. But the lane was in regular use by the residents of 3 properties and provided access to the parking area behind Birch Hardware. So vehicle traffic there was an ordinary daily occurrence, and the impression could not be matched to any specific vehicle with the technology available in 1996. No item of Clara's clothing was ever recovered. No biological material outside the yard. No fiber, no trace, no secondary impression of any kind beyond the yard itself. She had stepped off the grass and into nothing. A $15,000 reward, assembled through community fundraising and a matching contribution from a Providence civic organization, was announced on November 20th. It went unclaimed. A state police tip line received 211 calls over the following month. None produced actionable information. The search area was expanded in concentric rings outward from the Whitmore property, eventually covering an 11-mile radius. Nothing was found. There was one detail, however, that a young Providence County deputy named Sandra Reyes noted in her personal case log during the second day of investigation. A log that would not come to light until 22 years later, in 2018, when Reyes donated her career files to a cold case review project run by the Rhode Island State Police. On November 15, 1996, Reyes had been assigned to assist in a routine vehicle documentation sweep of the neighborhood, a standard procedure intended to establish which cars had been in the area during the relevant morning. She recorded the odometer reading of the Whitmore family's 1993 Ford Tempo, parked in the Whitmore driveway, 47,384 miles. She noted it because Martin had told investigators he had not left the house on November 14th. She then obtained, through the Motor Vehicle Registry, the odometer reading recorded at the vehicle's registration renewal in February of 1996, 47,131 miles. The difference between the two readings represented a gap of 253 miles accumulated over the 9 months between February and November. Average monthly usage derived from those numbers, approximately 28 miles. The discrepancy that caught Ray's attention was subtler than the total mileage. The reading appeared to have jumped more sharply than the average in the most recent weeks. Her supervisor told her the renewal reading could have been imprecise and that she should not build anything structural on odometer arithmetic. She wrote in her log, 17 miles, more or less. Inconsistency likely explainable, but it is there. The state investigation made a second formal interview of Martin Whitmore on December 3, 1996. The notes from that session are 3 pages long and describe him as cooperative and appropriate in his distress. No new information was obtained. He passed a polygraph examination on December 11, 1996, a result the defense would later cite extensively, and which the prosecution would counter by noting that polygraph reliability in subjects trained in emotional regulation is substantially lower than the general literature suggests. The case was formally classified as an open, unsolved missing persons matter on March 4, 1997, 110 days after Clara's disappearance. Deputy Sandra Reyes was transferred to a different unit that spring. The case file was placed in storage. The file cabinet was placed in a storage room at the Providence County Sheriff's Office. The door was locked. The reward expired unclaimed. The flyers on the telephone poles went pale and soft through the winter rains, and no one replaced them. By the spring of 1998, Donna Whitmore had relocated to Cranston, Rhode Island, to live near her sister Linda. She left Glenmorrow in March of that year, quietly and without ceremony, a moving truck departing Caldwell Lane early on a Tuesday morning before the neighbors were awake. The house was placed in the care of a property management company. Donna's departure was, by all accounts, a practical matter. The house was too large, the town too loud with association, the winter too long. She said none of this publicly. She simply left. Those on Caldwell Lane who noticed the moving truck waved to the driver out of habit and did not speak of it much afterward. Martin Whitmore remained at 114 Caldwell Lane for another 6 months after Donna's departure. Neighbors reported his car in the driveway through summer and into early autumn, present reliably, moving occasionally, no unusual pattern. The lights in the kitchen were observed on late, sometimes past midnight, by Ruth Prentice next door, who noticed because she herself suffered from insomnia and found herself watching the Whitmore window during her sleepless hours. She saw him once, she told investigators much later, standing at the kitchen sink at 2 in the morning, not doing anything with the sink, just standing. She had thought at the time that grief looked like that, standing very still in the small hours, watching nothing. He left Glenmorrow in September of 1998. He moved to Barrowfield, a town approximately 30 miles west and slightly smaller than Glenmorrow, where he eventually secured employment at an auto parts distribution center on Route 102. He bought a modest ranch house on a street called Elm Cross Drive, a street that had, by civic coincidence, no elms on it and nothing crossing it. He attended the local Methodist church, maintained his property with the same quiet competence he had brought to Caldwell Lane, and kept largely to himself through the first years of his time there. He remarried in August of 2003. His second wife, Patricia, was a woman of 50 who had 2 grown children from a prior relationship, and a temperament that those who knew her described as steady and generous. She met Martin at a church social. He had been attentive and easy to talk to, she would later say, the kind of man who listened rather than talked, which she had found restful. Nobody in Barrowfield knew about Clara Whitmore. Martin Whitmore had not told them. He had given Patricia, in broad terms, the account of a difficult previous marriage and a loss that he did not discuss in detail, attributing his reticence on the subject to the ordinary privacy of grief. Patricia had respected this. She understood, she had said, that some doors stay closed. She had not pressed. She had made the reasonable assumption that the loss he carried was the loss of a marriage, not the loss of a child, and certainly not the particular and devastating category of loss that the case would eventually reveal. Donna Whitmore, during those same years, existed in the particular silence of a woman who does not know and does know, and cannot bear to close the distance between those two states. In the one interview she gave to a Providence television station in November of 2001 on the 5th anniversary of Clara's disappearance, she appeared composed in a way that was visibly costly. She spoke about Clara's drawings. She said, quietly, "I still have all of them, every picture she ever made. I have them in a box and I look at them when I need to remember that she was real, that she was here." She was asked about Martin. She said only, "We couldn't stay together after. Some things break you apart." The interviewer did not press. The camera caught Donna's hands folded in her lap, very still, in a posture of practiced containment. For those who have ever doubted someone they loved, who have looked at a face across a breakfast table and felt the vertiginous uncertainty of not knowing whether what they are seeing is grief or something that only resembles grief. The years of Donna Whitmore's marriage after November 14, 1996, represent a kind of suffering for which the language has not yet fully accounted. There were moments, recorded later in the accounts of those closest to Donna, that accumulated significance only in retrospect. Her sister Linda recalled a conversation in the winter of 1997, shortly after Christmas, in which Donna had described waking in the night to find Martin sitting at the kitchen table in the dark. He had been looking at his own hands. She had asked him what was wrong. He had said, "Nothing, go back to sleep." She had gone back to sleep. She told Linda the story not as something alarming but as something confusing, another entry in the long list of things about Martin that she could not quite read. Linda had thought at the time that it was a man unable to sleep, wrestling with grief. Later, she would think about it differently. Among Clara's papers that Donna had preserved were the contents of a school exercise called My World, a collection of drawings made by Clara's class in October of 1996, the month before her disappearance. Each child had been asked to draw the people and places that made up their world. Clara had drawn the house on Caldwell Lane, the dog, her mother at the stove, her teacher, two friends from her class. She had drawn the rabbit in the winter coat that she had spoken about on the morning she vanished, a premonitory image, in its way, that no one had reason to wait at the time. And she had drawn one other image, which her teacher had noted as slightly unusual but had not pursued. A figure standing in a lane beside a dark-colored car, rendered in the flat, declarative lines of a second grader's crayon work. The figure had no distinguishing features, a circle for a head with no eyes or mouth drawn in, a rectangle for a body, simple lines for arms. The car was dark blue or black, difficult to say. The teacher had asked Clara who the figure was. Clara had said, "Just somebody." The teacher had moved on. Children drew peculiar things. The divorce was finalized in June of 1998. The grounds were irreconcilable differences, the legal language that covers the entire continent of what cannot be said in a courtroom. Donna told Linda that she had never directly confronted Martin with what she feared, that she had circled it for 16 months without landing, afraid that nomming it would make it true, or would break something that could not be put back together, or both. She said, "I was afraid of what he'd say. And I was afraid of what he wouldn't." In Barrowfield, Martin Whitmore's second life proceeded with surface unremarkability for the next decade and a half. Patricia described him, in accounts given to investigators after 2022, as thoughtful, occasionally distant, but kind in the ways that count. He had episodes of insomnia, which she had attributed to middle age and workplace stress. He drank more than she thought was wise, particularly in autumn, The weeks from mid-October through late November seemed to bring on a particular inwardness, a heaviness that she had come over the years to recognize and to accommodate without fully understanding. She had assumed seasonal depression. She knew the general shape of it, the early darkness, the cold, the shrinking of the days. She had not known that November carried a specific weight for him beyond what the season carries for most. She had not known that every November 14th he was somewhere in his mind, or perhaps in some literal and unremarked sense, standing at the edge of something he had done and could not undo. The cabin of the soul can only hold so much weight for so long, and November kept coming back. In the summer of 2021, Patricia Whitmore's granddaughter Lily, 9 years old and visiting for the weekend, found a cardboard box in the basement behind the furnace. Inside the box were several items. Among them, an old photograph of a young girl in a red coat and a small canvas backpack with what had once been a painted rabbit on the front, the paint faded now to a dim suggestion of shape. Lily brought the backpack upstairs and showed it to her grandmother, asking who the girl in the photograph was. Patricia did not recognize the backpack. She did not recognize the photograph. She told Lily to leave the items on the table and go play. She sat with the photograph for a long time, turning it over. On the back, in handwriting she did not recognize. CJW April 1996. She replaced the items in the box. She placed the box back behind the furnace. She did not ask Martin about it that day, or that week, or that month. She sat with what she had found for 6 months. In February of 2022, Patricia Whitmore placed a call to the Rhode Island State Police from the landline in the Barrowfield kitchen. She had, by that point, searched the name Clara Whitmore online. She had read the Providence Journal archives from November of 1996. She had read the 5th anniversary story from 2001, the one in which Donna Whitmore described keeping every drawing in a box. She knew what she was calling about. The call lasted 41 minutes. The officer who received it, a Detective Raymond Cost of the Major Crimes Unit, noted in his incident report that the caller's voice was, quote, controlled and deliberate, as if she had rehearsed what to say many times before saying it. She was cooperative and specific. She paused at the right moments and not at the wrong ones. She knew what she was doing. The investigation that reopened on March 9, 2022, was coordinated between the Rhode Island State Police Major Crimes Unit, the Providence County Sheriff's Office, and the Rhode Island Department of Attorney General, the same three-agency configuration that had worked the original case in 1996. Detective Cost led the reinvestigation. One of his first calls was to a retired deputy named Sandra Reyes, then 54 and living in North Providence. He asked her about the odometer notation in her 1996 case log. She remembered the number without hesitation. She said, "I've thought about that number a lot of times over the years. 17 miles, give or take, and nowhere I could put it at the time." Forensic investigators authorized by the court were permitted to examine the canvas backpack and its contents on March 1, 2022. The backpack had spent 26 years in basement conditions that had degraded significant biological material, but not all of it. A specialized mitochondrial analysis of 2 hairs found in the inner lining of the backpack's main compartment, hairs consistent in diameter and morphological characteristics with those of a child between the ages of 5 and 10, was completed by the Rhode Island State Crime Laboratory on March 7th. Donna Whitmore, contacted by investigators on March 2nd, provided a DNA reference sample the following day at a Providence laboratory. The comparison analysis was completed on March 8, 2022. The results were unambiguous. The hairs belonged to Clara Jean Whitmore. Martin Dale Whitmore was placed under surveillance on March 9, 2022, and was arrested on the morning of March 14, 2022, at 7:48 a.m. in the parking lot of the Auto Parts Distribution Center in Barrowfield, where he had worked for nearly 18 years. He was 59 years old. He was wearing a gray zip-up jacket over a flannel shirt and carrying a paper cup of coffee from the convenience station across the road. When Detective Cost approached him, identified himself, and stated the charge, Martin Whitmore set the coffee cup down carefully on the hood of his car. He set it down with a precision that suggested he was very focused on not spilling it, or on doing one ordinary, controlled thing in a moment that had ceased to be ordinary and was no longer under his control. He did not run. He did not argue. He did not speak for a long moment. A witness in the parking lot, a coworker who had known Martin Whitmore for 11 years, told investigators later that the expression on Martin Whitmore's face in that moment was not one she had seen before on anyone. She said, "He looked like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and someone had just told him he could put it down." He was charged with one count of first-degree homicide in the death of Clara Jean Whitmore. The arrest warrant cited the hair analysis, the odometer discrepancy, and a new statement from former mill supervisor George Farrell, now 71 and living outside of Orlando, Florida. Farrell told investigators that on the morning of November 14, 1996, he had received a call at the mill at approximately 8:15 a.m. from a longtime employee who had seen what he believed to be Martin Whitmore's Ford Tempo. He knew the car well, had ridden in it, traveling north on Old Birch Road, approximately 9 miles from Caldwell Lane, at a time when Martin had told police he was home watching the morning news. Farrell said he had assumed at the time that the employee was confused about either the time or the vehicle. He had not reported it to investigators. He said, "I didn't think it was my place to put that in front of someone without being sure. And then Clara was found not, and I told myself I'd been right not to say anything. And then 30 years went by and I understood that I had been wrong." The arrest was broadcast by Providence television stations the afternoon of March 14th and picked up by national wire services by the following morning. The response in Glenmorrow was the particular cocktail of shock and grim recognition that communities produce when a thing they had half wondered about for decades is finally said publicly and clearly. Ruth Prentice, Martin's former neighbor, told a television crew, "He mowed his lawn. He waved when you drove by. I don't know what else to say." A woman who had volunteered in the November 1996 search told investigators in a videotaped statement that she had spoken briefly with Martin at the Fire Station Coordination Center. She said, "He thanked me for coming out, very politely, very normally. I remember standing there thinking, he seems fine, and then I felt guilty for thinking it because grief is different for everybody. But it stayed with me. It stayed with me all this time." Patricia Whitmore issued a statement through her attorney on March 15th. The statement read in part, "I am devastated in ways I do not have words for. I am cooperating fully with all investigative authorities. I think of Clara Whitmore every moment of every day, and I think of Donna, and I am profoundly sorry." She did not give interviews. She did not appear publicly. She had been married to this man for 19 years. Donna Whitmore declined all media contact. Her attorney released a statement that read, "Clara deserved better. She deserved the truth a long time ago. I hope she can rest now." Donna Whitmore had been waiting, in one form or another, for 26 years. Martin Dale Whitmore entered a plea of not guilty on April 2, 2022. What would have been Clara's 33rd birthday, a coincidence of the calendar that nobody in the courtroom failed to notice. His defense team argued at the bail hearing that the evidence was circumstantial, that the decades elapsed made fair proceedings impossible, and that a man of his age and community ties presented no flight risk. The judge denied bail. The trial commenced on September 12, 2023, in Providence County Superior Court before Judge Marion Sorrell. Over 3 weeks, the prosecution presented the mitochondrial hair analysis and its match to Donna Whitmore's reference sample, the odometer evidence, and deputy raises original notation, the testimony of the coworker who had seen a vehicle consistent with the Whitmore tempo on Old Birch Road, the testimony of George Farrell regarding the call he had received, and the testimony of Patricia Whitmore, who described in clear and steady language the discovery of the box, the backpack, and the photograph, and the 6 months she had spent deciding what to do. The defense presented an alternate explanation for the backpack, that Martin had found it abandoned and kept it for sentimental reasons without knowing its origin. They challenged the hair analysis on grounds of chain of custody and degradation. They produced a defense expert, who argued the odometer discrepancy fell within the margin of routine recording error. On October 3, 2023, the jury of 8 women and 4 men retired to deliberate. They returned on October 6, after 19 hours of deliberation across 3 days. The verdict was guilty. The courtroom was, for one held breath, entirely silent. Martin Dale Whitmore was sentenced on November 14, 2023, the 27th anniversary to the day of Clara's disappearance. He received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. He said nothing at sentencing beyond the required acknowledgement that he had heard and understood the sentence imposed. He kept his eyes on the table in front of him throughout. He did not look at Donna Whitmore, who sat in the gallery directly behind the prosecution's table with her hands folded in her lap, very still, in the posture that the 2001 camera had caught, and that she appeared to have carried, like a form of discipline, through the entirety of the years between. There are cases that alter the way a community understands itself, that excavate beneath the ordinary surface of daily life. A depth that nobody wanted to discover was there. The disappearance and death of Clara Jean Whitmore did this to Glenmorrow, Rhode Island, and it did it twice. Once in 1996, when the town poured out to search and found nothing, and again in 2022, when the truth arrived and the search was finally, terribly answered. What the community was left with, after both eruptions, was the reckoning that closeness and knowledge are not the same thing, that familiarity is not a form of safety, that the man who waves from the lawn and coaches youth baseball and thanks the volunteers at the fire station might be carrying something that their proximity will never reveal. Clara Jean Whitmore loved to draw. She had a strong opinion about raisins in her oatmeal. She had recently lost a front tooth and the replacement had not yet come in. She told her mother on the morning she died that she was going to draw a rabbit in a winter coat. She wanted to be a veterinarian. She had a beagle named Pepper and a backpack with a painted rabbit on the front and a red coat with a missing button on the left cuff. She was 7 years old, completely and entirely, and she mattered completely and entirely. And the 26 years between her disappearance and the day justice arrived do not diminish that. They only deepen it. Donna Whitmore kept every drawing Clara ever made in a box. She looked at them when she needed to remember that her daughter was real, that she had been here. That discipline, of memory, of witness, of refusing to let the silence become the final word, is, in the end, the only language that outlasts a man who chose to say nothing. Justice arrived late. It arrived without a grave to mark and without a complete account to hold and without the comfort that complete accounts, even when they exist, never entirely provide. But it arrived. And for those who believed in Clara's memory through 27 years of frost and silence, Donna Whitmore most of all, hands folded, very still, keeping the drawings in a box, that arrival was not nothing. It was not enough, but it was not nothing.